Now like to, I know you're having wonderful conversations, as I was as well, but I do need to call us back to order, and I'd like to remind everyone we still have, hopefully we can get all of our online viewers back online, and to remind them that if they have any comments or questions, they can go to Twitter and use the hashtag BIFAD, hashtag BIFAD, to submit their comments and their questions. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Constas. He is from Cornell University, who will lead the next panel on the theoretical underpinnings of resilience measurement. Dr. Constas is the chair of the Technical Working Group on Resilience Measurement. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mark Constas.
Thank you for that introduction, and I would also like to open this panel by thanking BIFAD for organizing today's event on resilience measurement. I'm especially grateful because it's not typical to have an event dedicated to the topic of resilience of measurement in general and resilience measurement in particular. And I'd like to also point out that when discussions of this kind are organized on measurement, they're usually organized as a side event, or perhaps offered in a parallel session. And under such arrangements, there's a strong self-selection effect that has two groups interested in measurement moving away rather than toward one another. And I think this is unproductive. One group is a group of analysts or researchers, and the other is a group of policymakers or practitioners. It is therefore important to have discussion about resilience measurement organized as it is organized today, as a meeting of the whole, where opportunities for making connections between the technical qualities of measurement and the practical need for relevant measurement findings in support of decisions and in actual form of usable evidence can be explored, or as Greg Collins noted, actionable evidence. So that as an introduction, as a note of appreciation on resilience measurement not being cordoned off in a side event or as a side show on resilience measurement, it's good to be here in the whole. The presentation portion of this session will move quickly, with each panelist taking less than 10 minutes of presentation time. They've been allocated 7 to 8 minutes, and I'll manage that time. I myself will then offer a few minutes of concluding comments and introduce questions around which a moderated discussion among panelists will take place. This open discussion, which will last approximately 15-20 minutes, very brief, will be followed by questions first from the board and then from the general audience. So that is a general introduction. Let me now turn and just introduce the speakers, and the order is as noted in the agenda. And we'll start with Mushfiq Ahmed from Yale University. And I have to have a note on that. You may have to leave early and not stay for the full duration. Has a talk to give at the World Bank, and his apologies for that in advance. So we'll work around that, but certainly be here to start the presentation. Mushfiq will discuss his measurement work and findings related to lean season effects on income security, food prices, and food security in general. And he will discuss an intervention that offers incentives to encourage migration as a risk mitigation device, and other parts of his work. Then we then turn to Jen Cisse from the Bureau of Food Security at USAID. And Jen will focus on the importance of examining resilience over time by discussing some of the work supported by USAID. The measurement work Jen draws upon illustrates the theoretical underpinnings of resilience measurement that is drawn from Ethiopia, some Ethiopia-based research. We then will turn to Marco Dorico from UN's Food and Agricultural Organization. Marco will discuss his work on a very well-established approach to measurement called the Resilience Index Measurement and Analysis, or RIMA. It's a quantitative approach that enables a rigorous analysis of how households cope with shocks and stressors. As Marco will highlight in his presentation, RIMA covers a broad geographic area, and as I've recently learned, there are now more than 10 countries covering the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and I believe some things in Palestine from way back, and more recent work as well. So across the panelists, we have quite a broad geographic coverage and a broad range of interventions associated with resilience measurement. across the presentations, the various ways in which resilience measurement is built on and helps advance theoretical underpinnings or principles will be explored. So with that, let me turn it over to the first speaker. Yes, to Ahmed first. Or Mushfiq, sorry. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Wait. All right. Sit back down. Sorry. Going too quickly, or we're too aware of the time. And of course, then Joanna Upton, who's from, not to downplay Cornell, so I'm sorry. Joanna will discuss resilience measurement work in the context of emergency response, and his insights are drawn primarily from work in Niger and Ethiopia, though I know from my work with her that we've talked about, and now she's launching, I think, independently. She's also about to do some work, and may have started the work in Madagascar. It's kind of going to yet a broader region. So my apologies, Joanna. Sorry, I owe you whatever you decide my debt is. It could be a dangerous, like an open case. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me and for organizing this panel. So I'm an economist, a development economist. So I'll start with giving you a little bit of an overview of how economists think about resilience, right? So we think of the problem as, okay, how are people mitigating the adverse effects of shocks? Okay? And in the economics literature, there's a lot of research that's been done over the past 20 years on this question of how are people dealing with shocks. And we talk about 4 different markets, 4 different ways that people do it. Okay? So the first and most important market is insurance. Okay? Now, in rural areas of developing countries, often formal insurance markets are absent. But that doesn't mean that people are uninsured, because they would not survive otherwise after droughts. Right? And so what do? We instead rely on an informal social network. So we substitute for the formal insurance system with informal risk sharing. The idea is we're part of a community. I'm going to help you out when you need help, with the understanding in the future, if I need help, you're going to have to help me out. Okay? So that's the first market, insurance. The second thing you could do is you could rely on the credit market. You could take loans, right? So that could be, again, from informal sources, or it could be from formal banks or NGOs that provide loans, like microcredit institutions. Okay? So insurance, credit. The third thing you could do is self-insure through savings, if you're able to afford that. You put some money away, so that in times of need, you can draw down on that savings. And finally, the fourth one is that you could try and diversify your income sources. And one way to do that is to move away from where you live, so migration, right? And seasonal migration in particular, which is that during, say, the growing season, during planting and harvest, where there's a lot of work in rural areas, you work there. And the periods that are sort of lean periods in the rural areas, there's not much work, you could move somewhere else. Okay? So that would be another way to deal with shocks. And so of all those things, so I've mentioned insurance, credit, migration, and savings, right? So I have done work on both insurance markets and on the question of migration. And so I'll tell you a couple of stories today, one during this opening remarks, and maybe one when I get asked a question about insurance and migration. So let me actually start with, I was going to start talking about insurance because I thought it was the most related to the panel, but then since both Mark and earlier Greg in his remarks mentioned the migration work, I think I should just start with that, especially if I have to leave early and I don't ever get to it. Okay, so here's the issue in agrarian areas. And I'll use the calendar in Bangladesh where this work started, although we're now replicating this work in many other parts of the world. So in Bangladesh, the main rice harvest is in January, almond rice harvest. And there's a lot of work, and most of the people who are actually engaged in agriculture, they're landless. So they're supplying their labor on other people's farms. Okay? So in January, there's a lot of demand for their work. Wages are high. During planting in July, August, there's also demand for their work, so wages are high. But the period in between, September, October, November, is a lean period, right? Where what happens during this period is called monga, which is like a famine, a seasonal famine. What happens during this period is that wages fall because labor demand goes down. People are mostly just waiting for the crop to grow. Okay? And unfortunately, it coincides with the time that the price of rice is high. Right? Probably has to do with the fact that it's been the longest time since the last rice harvest, and there's some imperfections in storage and so forth. So this combination of high prices and low wages means that caloric intake goes down, and that's what the manga famine is. Okay? So the government, NGOs, so this is I grew up in Bangladesh. This is a problem that all of us knew about and talked about. And of course, the government knew about it. So the government and the very capable microcredit organizations in Bangladesh, they're doing things like food for work programs or targeted microcredit, et cetera, right? Which makes sense. However, my idea was something that I found puzzling, is that, look, there are some structural reasons why jobs don't exist in the rural area during that time. You have to wait for the crop to grow, right? So maybe it's going to be cheaper and easier for us to move people to where the jobs are rather than try to force job creation where the people are. Okay? And so that's where the idea of seasonal migration came from, right? And now I'm going to go into measurement a little bit, which is, so first, if I have this idea, we need to test it out. And one very good way to test things out is through randomized control trials. And you'll see this common thread in a lot of my work I talk about today, that a lot of my work is about this question of, in developing countries, we often see people not engaging in products or behaviors or technologies that we think are good for them, that are apparently beneficial, that might test well in the lab, right? Like the work we heard about this morning. It seems to do well when you do field tests, but then when you try to market that product or idea to people, people are resistant. They're hesitant to take up something new, they're risk averse, or they don't want to change their behavior. Behavior change is very difficult, right? So I work on problems with how to change behavior, and migration is a good example of that. And the way I try to change behavior, and I'm puzzled about why people aren't doing something that they should be doing, say, why are they not buying insurance? Or why are they not migrating? I just go and market that product. Okay? So the intervention I run was in rural Bangladesh, in some randomly chosen villages. I went and offered the equivalent, about $10, equivalent that pays for round-trip bus fare plus a few days of food to nearby cities. Okay? And the only condition for getting this grant is that somebody from the household, just one person, has to try this out, try to go migrate somewhere and find work during this period. Okay? And there was no other condition. There's no condition on where they have to go, who within the household has to go, or anything like that. Okay? I wasn't offering them a job. I was just giving them general information about, here are the cities where people often go to find work, here are the average wages in those cities, and the sectors where people find work, like construction sites or rickshaw pulling, et cetera. Okay? And so to study the effects of the program before we even contemplate scaling anything up, right? So we ran a randomized control trial where in some randomly chosen villages, we offered the grant, the $10 grant, conditional on migration. In another set of villages, we offer a loan conditional on migration. So same deal, it's a loan rather than a grant. In a third set of villages, randomly chosen, we offer just information without any money, right? Maybe the answer is that information is all they need, a push is all they need, right? And then, this is important, then in a fourth set of villages, we have a control group where we're not implementing the program, but we are collecting the exact same data. Okay? And so let me just quickly tell you what happens. So result number one is that in the control group, 35.9% of households migrate. So a third of households are trying this out anyway, right? That's part of their risk mitigation strategy. That's part of the resilience. And when I provide information, 35.9% of households migrate. Right? So that's why the control group is important. Right? It has absolutely a 0.0% effect on behavior. Right? And if you think about it, if a third of households are migrating, one of my 3 neighbors is going, right? Then Mushfiq coming and saying, oh, you should migrate is not going to change my behavior. Right? Because I already know that that's feasible. Right? However, when I provide the loan or the grant, the migration rate jumps up to 56 and 60%. So you can induce about a quarter of households, 25% of households, to try it out. Okay? So that's result number one. So now I have this random variation migration, which I can use to study the effects of migration. So result number two is that when you are induced to travel by this program, then your family remaining behind, which is where I collect all my data in the rural area, those families end up consuming 600 calories per person per day more. Okay? It was a surprisingly large effect. So they moved from 2 meals a day, which was the average food intake during that manga period, from 2 meals to 3 meals a day. Okay? And then result number 3 is that a year later, 3 years later, I didn't repeat the program in a subset of villages so I could track long-term effects, right? And you observe that about half the households who were induced to move, they continue to remigrate in future years, right? It doesn't stay up at 60%, it's about 50% in the second year and the third year, right? right? So a lot, and here's a clue as to why that happened. When I go back and interview these households as to what they were doing in 2011, even though I pushed them back in 2008, so they say that we went back and worked for the same employer who we had met back in 2008. So the asset that they grow here is not savings or anything like that. They're eating, because they're very hungry, they're eating everything. The asset they grow is a connection to an employer, right? Who says, okay, you've proven yourself to be a reliable worker, come back next year, you can have the same job. Okay? So then finally, given the topic of discussion today, we should talk about why do we see these effects. Okay? And the reason this is important is because before we can contemplate policy action or scale up, we really need to understand what was preventing them from migrating to begin with, which goes back to my research agenda, which is why were people not migrating, even though it's obviously a sensible thing to do in the sense that you can get them to go, they do better, and then they go back on their own. It changes their long-term behavior. Right? Okay, so I'll just end with that story. So here's where an economist writes down a complicated mathematical model. I will not present that, right? But I'll present it in the form of a story. Okay, so imagine I were to offer you a lottery ticket, okay? And I say it costs $10, okay? And 80% of the time it'll pay off, which is exactly what I see in my data. The lottery ticket, by the way, is a bus ticket, okay? Hint. So 80% of the time it'll pay off, and when it pays off, you'll get back like a 500% return. You'll get back $60, okay? And 20% of the time you'll lose your money. Would you buy that ticket? Yes, you should. When I ask this question at business school, people say yes much more quickly. Right? Right? It's a good deal, right? And that's the puzzle here, right? That's the ticket people aren't buying. Okay? So now imagine that I keep the deal exactly the same, right? 80% chance of success, 500% payout. Except I say the ticket now costs $10 million. So you'll get back 60 million or you lose 10 million. Would you buy it?
If I had that.
Yeah, it's much harder to make that decision for us, right? Or conversely, I can say, imagine now that it's the $10 ticket, like I have in my program, but that it's a really good deal again, 80% chance of success, but you are under the threat of famine, you're a subsistence farmer very close to subsistence, and if you're $10 poorer, you might fall below subsistence and something devastating might happen in your family. Would you buy that ticket? That's the problem people have, right? It's that people are extremely risk averse when they're so poor, right? And that prevents them from going after these massive upside opportunities just because they cannot handle the downside risk, right? So this is a market failure. What market is failing here? It's the insurance market, okay? And how the program works is it's not a grant that's required. It's just that if we can insure the downside risk, right, then that allows people, so it's working like insurance, that allows people to think about the upside opportunities. Because the deal is basically, try this out. If you come back and you fail, you're no worse off. There is a 20% chance of failure here. That's what we learned. Okay? So, so now in my last 2 minutes, I'll just talk about the scaling of the program. Okay? So this is what we learned. We understood that the program works in Bangladesh at that scale. I tried it out the first year in 2008. I tried it out with about 2,000 households. Okay? We also understood why the program worked, right? And I went back and tested that. The story I just told, I went back and tested it. And the way I did it was 3 years later, I went and offered an insurance program for migration. It was something like this, not exactly, that here's $10 for you to migrate. If it works out, you need to pay me back $15 to cover the insurance premium. If it doesn't work out, you don't have to pay me back. Right? And that works even better, because that's basically insurance. Okay? It's not exactly like that because if you announce that you don't have to pay back if it doesn't work out, then it's not going to work out for anyone, right? So I have to do something more clever than that, but I won't get into it. All right, so then what happened following the publication of these results is that there were some very nice rich people who got interested in, these are people with Silicon Valley money and interested in this effective altruism or effective philanthropy movement, right? They were interested in this idea and saying, why don't we scale this up as policy? Right? And so my reaction to that was, well, first of all, it's nice that somebody read the paper, but however, I am worried that, look, I'm showing you these results with 2,000 households, and I stand by those results. This is a well-done trial. However, if you start inducing 20,000 people or 200,000 people to move, the results might not look the same. Okay? We have to worry about a lot of other things. First of all, if a lot of people start moving out of the village economy might change. If skilled people leave, maybe the unskilled people in the village will be worse off. There's possibility of negative spillover effects, right? Maybe. We should study that. If you go to 200,000, there's possibilities of negative spillover effects on the city. We need to think about that. There might be unintended consequences of migration, right? Typically, it's the adult male that's leaving, and children are without their father for 2 or 3 months. That might have some consequences. The husband and the wife are apart, right? Maybe it leads to more divorces, or he finds somebody else in the city, or even brings back diseases. We need to track all of those things. And all of those risks also vary by location, right? And I also was worried about, does this really improve welfare? So I just told you that caloric intake goes up, right? Which is a pretty broad measure, but that's still not welfare, right? We have to be thinking much more deeply about it in the sense that that increase in consumption comes with some family separation, right? So what we did over the last 5-6 years is first scale this program up from 2,000 to 30,000. At that scale, we could study spillover effects on the village. To this year, we made 150,000 offers in Bangladesh. And at that scale, we can start thinking about effects on the city. I also started thinking about welfare, started collecting data on other non-economic unintended consequences. And so we're kind of proceeding and scaling up step by step and learning and running trials at a different scale with different designs in the process. Right? It requires a fundamentally different design for me to think about the spillover effect on the village. And if there's time during the Q&A, I can definitely cover that. Okay, but my time's up now. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Next is Jen Cisse.
I have a PowerPoint. Yeah, there it is. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. My name's Jennifer Cisse. I'm a senior risk advisor in the Bureau for Food Security at USAID, so I'm so excited that so many people turned out today. It's really excellent to have this opportunity to talk about resilience and resilience measurement specifically. When we were talking about how we were going to split up the conversation, I thought it might make sense to just talk about one component of resilience measurement. So I'm going to focus on dynamism, but as the senior risk advisor, I also manage our centrally funded insurance portfolio, so I'm hoping that at some point we'll have a chance to talk more about insurance. I'd be really happy to talk about that. Let's see. So I'd like to start just by talking about a story. This woman here is named Daki, and you can actually read more about her story on the USAID website at stories.usaid.gov, Milk for Life. So Daki is a dairy entrepreneur. She used to take her milk every day to the road and wait for people to come by and buy it. But she was now connected with a milk processor who got a grant from one of the USAID-sponsored projects in Ethiopia, Prime. And that connection to milk processing and to the bigger milk market allowed her to become more of an entrepreneur and an aggregator. So not only does she sell her own milk to this processor, but she actually aggregates milk from others in her community. So this has worked out really well for Daki. She's been able to start accumulating savings. She's been able to invest more in her business. But she also can accumulate stocks to protect her cattle in periods of drought, for example. So this is a great story. Daki's doing well. But how do we know if she's resilient? Is she non-poor? And if there is a drought, how will she be affected? So in order to understand whether Daki's resilient, we really have to think about, what happens to her household, and her community over time, particularly in the face of some of the shocks that she's experiencing. And this brings me back to something that Beth Dunford mentioned when she was talking, some ODI work on poverty backslides. So these are the data from Ethiopia, from rural Ethiopia. They're Ethiopia Rural Household Survey data, and this analysis, as Dr. Dunford mentioned, was done by ODI for ACDI VOCA through a USAID activity. And as you can see, so they took different chunks of time and looked at what are poverty transitions for households in Ethiopia over these time periods. And so the bottom row actually shows an earlier time period, and then as you go up, you see more recent time periods. And what you see is that actually, 20 years ago, almost half of households were staying out of poverty. But over time, we see fewer households staying out of poverty and more households slipping into poverty. So just looking at the number of people who are poor today doesn't necessarily tell us about economic growth. It doesn't tell us about resilience. Or the well-being trajectory of households. So we really have to pay attention to these dynamics about households coming out of poverty, households staying in poverty, households falling back into poverty. So I thought in order to illustrate this, maybe we could play with some totally made-up data. So I made up a little data set to show the importance of well-being dynamics. And in this case, we're looking at income specifically. It doesn't have to be income, but it's really easy to talk about money metrics. So here we have data from 4 households over 10 years, right? And you can look at this, you have a bunch of data sets. In this case, we have panel data, which is excellent, but you could imagine that this is just cross-sectional data. And you see a bunch of points, right, over time and some monetary values associated with that. But what does that really tell us about dynamics, about well-being dynamics? Well, what we would typically do is we'd say, okay, what's the average? What's happening on average? And we say, there seems to be a little dip after a couple years. Maybe there was a drought. And then, oh, look, it's going up on average. That's great. So we have a nice story here about income growth. And what we should do is we should just plot a line, right? We're going to do some linear regression, get a nice little plot, and we see, look, over a 10-year period, there was an increase from below $1 per person per day in income to over $1.50. That's awesome, right? It's a great story. But this averaging and taking just these linear trajectories kind of muddles the story a little bit, and we don't actually see what's happening to each of the individual households. So if we break it out a little bit, we can look at the different household income dynamics. So now we look at each different household, right? So we've got a household down at the bottom, we have a household up at the top, and we can see how each household is growing, how their income is changing over time. As I remember, these are totally made up data, but it's just to illustrate something. So we see, yes, there is on average this linear trend that we showed, but actually the households that are at the bottom don't appear to be moving up. In fact, we can see that there's actually a threshold, a poverty trap threshold or a macabre threshold here, and once a household slips below that threshold, they're never able to get back out again. But the 2 households at the top, not only are they not as deeply affected by the shock to begin with, the household at the very top was never even affected by the shock. They maybe didn't accumulate income over that time, but they didn't have a negative shock to their income. But they're able to continue growing, right? But the 2 other households, one is never able to escape poverty, and the other slips back into poverty, right? So this shows us that it's important to look at not just average trajectories, but actually pay attention to how households are managing shocks, what's happening to them based on where they started. So, a couple of key takeaways. One is it's really, if possible, important to use panel data to track households over time, instead of just looking at cross-sectional data that doesn't allow us to tease out what's happening to individual households based on where they were before. It allows us to control for past levels of well-being. This kind of is the old adage that it takes money to make money, which we can see actually is the case. If you don't have access to money or assets, you can't invest in your own income growth, right? So households that are below that threshold aren't able to accumulate savings or investment and kind of grow out of poverty. And then also it allows for nonlinear well-being dynamics and poverty traps. Those are different things that we'd like to be able to take into consideration when we're looking at resilience measurement. So I'm over time. I just wanted to mention quickly, one thing that USAID is doing in this space is work on recurrent monitoring surveys. So USAID and Tango, and you'll be hearing from both Tiffany and Tim, hopefully a little bit more about this in the next session. They partnered to develop this resilience recurrent monitoring survey. And what's great about recurrent monitoring surveys is that instead of looking at annual data and asking households to do recall, we can actually get more frequent data. And these data collection activities are triggered by an event. So it's very cost effective. You don't necessarily do this high frequency data collection constantly, but you wait until there's a potential shock event and then you start collecting data. So these are the types of innovations that USAID is working on in partnership with some of you. So we'd like to take an opportunity to talk about this and some of the other things we can do together to start thinking about resilience measurement and not just poverty measurement. So thank you.
Good morning, and first of all, thank you for inviting us. My name is Marco De Rico from FAO, and we are very happy to be here. I'm actually here on behalf of my boss, Luca Russo, so I'll try to wear two hats, presenting two slightly different, so pretend I'm not Marco now, I'm Luca. Okay? So we will briefly talk about RIMA. RIMA stands for Resilience Index Measurement and Analysis. Luca was not happy. So let's try this way. So we will talk of resilience index measurement and analysis. Is the tool that we developed at FAO. RIMA roots back to 2006 when the first seminal paper was published by Prabhu Pingali, Luca Linovi, and Jackie Sutton. So this is where we started, and then in 2008, 2009, we managed to launch the first attempt on measuring resilience. And I must say that over time we've been happy to learn from every possible suggestion. So our approach is quite open, and we try to remain always open. On this, I strongly buy and support what Greg was saying about linking links between practitioners, as I like to be considered, and academia, because we don't have the capacity, we don't have the brains, we don't have the time, we don't have the resources for doing analysis and researches and improving our tools. So every time that is possible, we try to link together with academia and to try to bridge these two worlds, no? The simple world of the field and the more sophisticated but extremely useful world of academia. With regard to, okay, I will quickly guide you through the principles that are underpinning our tool. RIMA is, I recognize that I need the glasses because I can't see very well. That's so sad. So I'm getting old, and it's impossible. So RIMA is a quantitative approach that tries to estimate household resilience, so to food insecurity. So three different concepts here. We are interested at household level, although we recognize the importance of resilience to different levels, like community resilience, village resilience, market resilience we were talking about before, or other systems of resilience. Our focus of interest is on household level. Why is that? Because as agencies, we are interested in food security. So food security is our outcome of interest. Greg was mentioning the example of well-being or poverty. In our case, we are interested in food security. And finally, we have this word, resilience. And once again, I agree with many things that Greg said. I'm sorry to mention you so many times. It's so much important to recognize the different definitions of resilience. Until a couple of years ago, when someone told me it's not the case to do so, but I was presenting one of the first slides was reporting three different definitions from FAO on resilience. So they are not communicating each other. So I was cancelled. So basically, we apply a mixed method, latent variable models, and regression analysis. The reason why we use this is because we understand that we need to do some simple regression analysis to get the determinants. So that is to arrive to the final key variable, final key indicator that we do need to bridge our very nice analysis to the policy setting and to go back to some policymaker and suggest some precise intervention. There are, of course, some technical background. We build up on psychometric, we build up on item response analysis, and we basically created this multidimensional index. You may be aware of there are many different ways to approach a multidimensional index. In our case, using latent variable model, we adopt a system that creates the different, evaluates the different weights of the components of resilience through data analysis. To make a long story short, think about intelligence. We approach resilience as intelligence, so that's why we build up on a psychometric. There is no direct way of measuring intelligence. Intelligence can be measured as the combination of different aspects of intelligence, logic, memory, problem-solving capacity, and whatever else. You pull them together, and during the 40s and the 50s, psychometrics come back with this idea that this is the latent concept underlying the different aspects. As basically, we are approaching this in the same way. Other very relevant principles that are guiding our analysis, the institutionalization. That is to say, we are trying to make sure that what we do is not done at desk level at FAO in Rome by Marco or Luca or whoever else, but it's done mainly with by the institutions in the country. You know, we as agencies, we are very much connected with the country, so we have a lot of capacity building exercises implemented in country. In Niger, for example, we work very closely with the INS, the Institut National de Statistique, and they are doing the resilience analysis themselves. In Senegal, the Conseil National de Sécurité Alimentaire, they have done the RIMA analysis themselves. That's our scope. That's our purpose. We are not interested in having a very sophisticated analysis which is just valid for us. We try also to publish. We got our paper published in different academic journals, which is a reference for us, and we need it. But then our main purpose is to institutionalize our process and face the biggest problem that we do have. We all know the RCT, we all know the panel data, we all know that the perfect data set will be enabling us to do the perfect analysis. But in my case, at least, it's almost never the case. I need to adapt to what I have. And once again, Greg was mentioning Somalia. Somalia is like my second home in Africa, and I go there, and there it's quite tight. It's quite complicated to get very good and reliable data. So we try to adapt to what we do have. Another example is to link what we do to the programmatic aspects. So the example that I'm mentioning here is on one of the largest community of refugees in the world. Uganda is hosting 1.3 million refugees. 1 million of them is South Sudanese. We went there in the camps. We've been collecting data, and we are linking all our findings to the programmatic efforts of FAO for the next 3 years and other UN agencies, all under the Office of Prime Minister and the National Bureau of Statistics. Because otherwise we are not doing our work, we are doing a fancy and sophisticated and interesting analysis, but we are not working with the countries, which is at the end of the day the only thing that matters. So this is another example, another principle guiding us. In terms of the dimensions of RIMA, we of course acknowledge and recognize the validity of the different 3 capacities, transformative, absorptive, and adaptive capacities, which are perfectly fine, and we are perfectly happy with them. In our case, we maintain a partition which includes 4 more practical and banal aspects, which is adaptive capacity, social safety nets, access to basic services and assets. And the reason why we do this is just because this is more consistent with every log frame of the program that we are creating, or that FAO is doing, or other agencies are doing. So this makes us more capable to link our analysis to the logical framework of the projects. That's the only reason why we use this other type of dimensions. Finally, we are trying to explore different linkages. Now, this slide is particularly difficult to me. And so one very interesting aspect that we are exploring is the subjective measure of resilience and the perception of resilience. And I'll talk about this in the next session with Tiffany. Okay, and the effect of conflicts and other possible stressors and shocks with respect to resilience. And I find extremely interesting the concept of dynamic, which is one of the biggest difficulties and constraints that we all practitioners are facing. with this, this is, as Marco was mentioning, this is just an example of, not an example, this is the map of the different data analysis that we've been doing. As Marco was saying, we are covering quite a lot of countries. In some cases it is at country level, in some other cases it's more regional, specific areas level. And on top of this, we are also working in different Central American countries together with SICA, the regional organization. And that's it. The take-home final messages, the importance of drawing on psychometric theory for underpinning our resilience measurement, the importance of choosing the right dimensions, so they must be linked to the programmatic efforts, and the importance of finding a way to measure and explain the causal relationship between resilience and their determinants. So that's my last presentation. Okay, my last slide. Thank you.
Last but not least,
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Thanks to also BIFAD for putting together this event. I, too, am very pleased to see an event focused on measurement as an economist. That's an exciting element. And thanks, Mark, for the albeit reluctant introduction. So
just delayed.
Delayed, okay. So I, too, am a development economist, as many others here, but I come from a policy background as well with an IR degree, and that's kind of actually a common theme among my Cornell colleagues here, as it turns out. We have that background, which leads to a diverse interest in resilience, both from an analytical side, as in, can we improve poverty measurement, the poverty dynamics, building on that economic literature, but also very much from a pragmatic side, is how can we make this more useful, and how can this be more than just a passing buzzword, and so on, right? We're very interested in that. So my work really works at that intersection, this academic policy intersection that we're talking about here, where most of my research has been with UN organizations, mainly WFP, CG institutions, mainly ILRI, and then several different NGOs, and very recently also Cometrica under FuseNet, and it's from that work that I'll draw kind of a brief example on what I'm talking about. But to that end, the short answer to the question that I pose here is that, yes, resilience and the concept of it can be useful in this particular context of emergency response, but it does depend on a few different trade-offs, and one of those is between the kind of the cost and difficulty of measurement and the pragmatic needs of finding answers to acute questions. It also depends, and this is speaking to Mark's heart, I believe, on how well theoretical principles are applied in that, and I think this builds pretty directly on some of what Marco was just saying, and also what Jen brought up. So to that end, I'm going to focus on basically 2.5 principles that kind of unite measurement and those theory and those practical measurement sides, the half being a cross-cutting idea of the dynamics Jen mentioned. And then I'll give a brief example of how I find that these principles in a certain application prove to be useful. So the first principle is this alignment between measurement and definition. So I'm not going to, as Greg noted early on, litigate the various definitions. We do agree that there are some common threads. But one point that I'm going to make is that measurement methods basically come out on the debate one way or another, which is to say there are measurement debates, and the method you choose to measure resilience implicitly or explicitly puts forward a definition, or at least focuses on one element or the other of a definition. For example, a method itself will either model resilience as a capacity or a set of capacities. So you ask a question like, does resilience improve well-being? Or you're looking at resilience as this set of capacities, versus thinking of resilience as more the outcome or its properties. And that's saying, say, what drives resilience, and resilience being the ability to maintain your food security, and that's the resilience, right? If you look at that outcome side, is it an outcome and its properties, where you say, okay, an outcome is food consumption, and we're looking at resilience as the ability to maintain that food consumption? Or is it really a suite of outcomes where you have more of an index approach? And REMA leads toward that, where it's a number of different outcomes that are important. Another debate that's there is it really just the inverse of vulnerability, so this shock response, or is it that path to recovery, or is it both? And even if you believe that it's one or the other or both, the measurement method will emphasize or allow you to look at one or the other or both. and in turn related to that path to recovery? Is it a return to a starting state, so a path to recovery like that, or are you really paying attention to what that starting state is? And are you thinking about the persistence in maintaining an acceptable normative level of well-being? So within all of that, the kind of third cross-cutting thing is how well is time reflected, and Jen did a great job at touching on that particular issue. So the second one that I'll focus on is the alignment in turn between measurement and the goals of measurement. That's something very important to think about. There are two sets of goals. One set is really analytical. So as academics, we can say, do we want to describe who's resilient and who's not? Do we want to compare resilience across contexts? Are we trying to be inferential, where we're saying, how does something impact resilience or change it? Or are we trying to predict who's going to be resilient in the future? These analytical goals tie very closely to the pragmatic goals. So are we looking to identify the impacts of a program? Some measurement approaches with linked to that inferential side that I note above lend themselves more to that than others. Are we looking at targeting resources to the poor? And in that case, really predictive analytical goals are more pertinent because it's prediction that allows you to say, focus on targeting. And then, of course, on the pragmatic side, there are these other logistics, like Marco touched on, availability of data. Do you have data over time so that you can bring in dynamics or not? How many things, are you able to collect all these psychosocial dynamics in this setting or not? There are data restrictions in that respect. So the particular method that I'll focus on, which I worked on with Commetrica, comes out in one direction or another on this. And we tried to think through this in line of bringing together the theory, the measurement approach, and then the goals of that measurement. For example, in this debate, we come out in thinking of resilience as more of an outcome and looking at how that outcome changes over time, partly to meet pragmatic goals of interpretation, basically. So we preferred that side of it, where you can then look at drivers or capacities to some degree, but you're really focusing on an outcome. We also look at more one outcome and its properties, so in this case, consumption expenditure, as opposed to a suite, again, for ease of interpretation and trying to get at predictive goals. We tried to look at both the vulnerability and path to recovery, but data constraints are important here. There are also questions as to whether dividing those up and looking at the shock response and the recovery separately is really necessary for all of the goals that you're trying to reach. Sometimes it may or may not be necessary. And then in our case, we're definitely looking at resilience as a normative state, where we care about what your level is, because if you're looking to target resources and humanitarian aid, it really matters if people are below the poverty line or not just whether they recover to a state, if that state is extremely poor. So on that side, we come out there, we try to take into account that dynamics are important, and I'll show you an example of how these dynamics end up being important. And then the pragmatic goals relate to basically this idea of being able to find a method that can be used and reused and that can have meaning in multiple contexts. So using largely available data, developing something replicable, and then trying to use it for a targeted end. I'll go into that a little bit more. Available data. So this particular approach, we piloted using LSMS data. So these are not easy data, as most of you know. They're very complex, but they're available in the sense that they're increasingly being collected in many countries, and they're collected as panels, which gives you the ability to gradually use that dynamic methods in this setting. So we focused on 2 different countries, and then also available data being climate indicators that are basically increasingly universally available. And we can link those to specific households or areas. In our case, NDVI, a measure of basically rangeland health, and SPEI, a measure of precipitation. I'm focusing mostly on the latter. The replicability idea, so this method built very closely on a method that was developed by Jen Cisse and Chris Barrett with her academic hat on back at Cornell, which uses a moments-based approach, and it has the ease of interpretation of being basically interpreted as a probability of achieving a certain level of well-being, an acceptable level of well-being in a state, in a time period, given your prior experience. So you need some data over time on the same households or communities to do that. Perfect. And as part of the replicability or advantage of this method in terms of that is that it's not very sensitive to what you include. It has some structure inherent in it, and even if, say, in one setting you have a variable for access to credit, that's different from another setting. One of them you have whether or not you accessed credit in the last year. One of them you have the amount of total debt. This method doesn't really change much if you have different ways of measuring your variables, and that helps with the ease of interpretation. That we messed around with all kinds of controls and used machine learning approaches where you just throw in the kitchen sink, and the method was relatively consistent in terms of having the same major takeaways about the importance of drought. We chose consumption expenditure as an outcome, again, for the idea of this interpretability. What can this tell you in terms of what your poverty gap is? And then also looked at shocks that are measurable externally, like the SPI and NDVI, and self-reports of shocks like deaths in the household and so on. So just to give a very brief example, and I'm almost out of time, so I'm pretty much spot on, of how these things came together to show a specific, potentially useful application of resilience. What we're looking at here is in the Ethiopia data, in the Ethiopia LSMS data, the left-hand side is the Cisse and Barrett resilience score. So that 0 to 1 is basically interpreted as your percentage likelihood of falling above the poverty line in the third period, in the third wave of data, because we had 3 years, conditional on where you were at in the prior periods and controlling for a series of characteristics. The bottom axis is just your average consumption expenditure in period 3. So we're plotting those two together. And part of the point you can see here is that they do kind of move together, but there's different information clearly captured. And this resilience score is plotted using consumption expenditure. So it's basically saying, what is your likelihood of falling above the poverty line in that period? And we draw the line there at a 50% likelihood. The other one is your actual consumption expenditure in that period. Now, if you were to target people in period 3 based on just their consumption expenditure in that period, what you're looking at here is that those below the or to the left rather of the vertical line are the targeted households. If you were to use that resilience score, those below the horizontal line are the ones who are targeted, and we're not capturing the same people. And so to check if there's improvement happening here by using that dynamic approach, using time, using this resilience score, we looked at the differences between these households, and indeed, basically along every metric, even things not included in the regression analysis, the group that were targeted based on that CB score were worse off. They tended to be larger households, more likely to be female-headed, had lower community resources and other things. So basically using this dynamic approach was somehow capturing more information and getting a more precise targeting measure that's contingent on past experience and on shocks and everything else. So it's just a way of showing, I hope, that basically using these kind of theoretical principles to guide what measurement approach you use, why you're doing it, and what goals you can realistically achieve with it does lead to something that could be pragmatically useful. So that's the general takeaway from this approach. I very much look forward to discussion, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and the panelists as a whole for the presentations. Before we proceed to the next part of this panel, I need some guidance from the organizers. How are we on time, and what's our time? I know our time allocation as far as what's supposed to happen in sequence, but we're at 11:30 right now, and with the revised schedule, I think I need to target 12:15. Okay, so we'll do about 15 as well. Okay, very good. Great. Okay, thank you. I'm going to make a few comments and then introduce some questions and get responses from the panelists. And I just want to introduce a few of the themes that came out here. And one is I want to start actually on a low note by acknowledging the poor reputation of theory. In speaking with the organizers of this event, we talked about whether we'd be better off talking about this as theory or principles. And I'm happy enough to talk about this as theory, but we do need to acknowledge that theory in general has a not so positive connotation, at least in some circles. Theory is seen as overly abstract, fraught with jargon. It's not uncommon to hear references to something being rendered not terribly useful because it's too theoretical. I'm in settings, and some others suffer this burden as well, as being an academic and being told that what you're doing is too academic. It's not surprising given who some of us are. or said that's just theory, or say that may work in theory, but it won't work in practice, which the counter argument is that may work in practice, but it won't work in theory, which is the right thing to say, I suppose. So theory is something that is seen as too abstract, but I believe each of our speakers, and this is where I want to turn it to a more positive note, each of our speakers demonstrated by talking about the work they're engaged in, provide an effective series of counterpoints to the idea that theory can indeed be useful. And I would say there's nothing more practical than a good theory. So let me speak to the second point here, which also is somewhat negative, but I'll bring it to a positive note as well. Allowing theory to serve as a driver for measurement runs the risk, some believe, of having measurement practices that are idealistic, difficult to implement, and potentially inhumane. And here I recall a debate we had a few years ago in Rome when we were starting the Resilience Measurement Technical Working Group. When trying to establish a framework for measurement, one of our colleagues invoked an automobile metaphor. And I think it might have been Luca who said this, Luca Rousseau, who's not here, which gives me freedom to talk about him and put words in his mouth. He said, what you may be trying to design here is a Lamborghini or a Ferrari. Maybe we need just a Fiat. And speaking to the need for simplicity. And I also like to explain the reference to measurement as being potentially inhumane. In one study we had reviewed, it involved a household survey that lasted nearly 2 hours. And some of you who do work in developing countries may have witnessed these kinds of surveys. You may have perpetrated them as well. In a world where in resilience, where we're concerned with the effect of disturbances, this kind of survey itself may be counted as a shock. Sometimes occurs to me. It takes people out of the labor market, takes them out of the field, but any event. So here too, I think that some of the comments of the panelists provide an effective counterpoint, referring to the use of secondary data sets, existing data streams, and thinking about the work Marco's doing, and thinking about trying to reduce metrics to something from a large number of metrics using factor analysis to a more precise measurements. So I think we have two useful counterpoints there, one for the decrepit state of theory or its reputation, trying to resurrect it from its poor state, and secondly, thinking about more efficient forms of measurement that are a good. Maybe I should replace some set of Fiat, say a Prius or something instead. But the last point I'd like to make before turning it to introduce some questions for the panelists to respond to is the point that was mentioned by a number of panelists, and I think all of the work considers time and the importance of dynamics. This is a really important point and one which I think people who are on both sides of the funding table may think about, is that change and dynamics that account for our well-being, our observations of well-being, and how we explain it over time are utterly indifferent to things like funding cycles. The rates of change, if we're thinking about things like systems and institutions and governance, how long does it take for that to show up? But yet we have, just because of the nature of how sponsored research works, we have funding cycles. And sometimes the funding cycles, or in our world as academics, things like a tenure clock, determine what kind of research one can do and when they can turn that research around and produce results and get it in a journal and move forward. So we have these forces, I think, which work sometimes against intelligently designed studies where we can look at time in the appropriate time frames. So I think that's the third point, and I think Jen's talk and the talk of comments of others, Jen turned to dynamism, but thinking about temporal aspects of measurement really are critical. So those are the end of my comments. What I'd like to do now is just to have a number of questions I can pose to the panel, invite panelists to respond both to the question and to each other as well. And what I'd like to start with is something that was raised in a number of the comments that were given here. And the question I have is, what are some of the implications for application, thinking in terms of programming and policy, associated with your work and or your perspective on resilience measurement? And I ask this in thinking forward to a session that's going to be happening this afternoon that Tiffany will be chairing, and thinking about the applications. So one question I have is that everyone here talked about measurement, talked about metrics, talked about analytics, and I think it's useful if we have a response. What are the implications of your work for programming and for policy? So anyone, yes?
I'm happy to go, and after these comments I might have to slip out, I'm sorry.
Are the mics on? Yeah, you're good.
Yes, I'll just pull it closer. Okay, yeah, thanks for that question. Actually, it sets up really nicely for this, the second story I wanted to tell that Jennifer wanted me to talk about index insurance. She's in charge of that portfolio for one of the 8 programs. I'm going to give you a defense of theory. Okay, so first, in my opening remarks, I made the point that having randomized control trials, meaning good counterfactuals, good control groups, right, is really useful for us. It's useful in entomology research, it's useful in agronomy research, it's also useful in economics research. We want good counterfactuals, right? But now I'm going to tell you a story about why that's not sufficient, why theory is still important, and sometimes, even after you have gold standard empirical evidence, you might learn nothing of value, right, without thinking through the proper theory. Yeah. So one of the other things I've been puzzled about, just like why people weren't migrating, is why people weren't buying insurance. Okay? So in South Asia, say India, about 80 to 90% of interannual variability in livelihoods in rural areas is due to variation in weather. A bit in temperature, but mostly rainfall, right? And so you'd expect people to be really interested in rainfall insurance, right? I mean, if like we insure against activities or actions that don't affect our livelihoods that much, like car accidents, okay? But the formal insurance markets are largely absent. But as I said, people are informally insured, right? So I wanted to understand why is it that people weren't buying insurance? And so my strategy, as always, is to try and sell insurance. So I'm an insurance salesman in India as well. Bus ticket salesman in Bangladesh. Okay, so here's what happens in India. Okay, so there are, just like in the Bangladesh scenario, there are cultivators and there are landless laborers. So people who have land, I'll call them cultivators, and then landless laborers who supply their labor to the landed guys, right? And in India, because of this history of a common law heritage, you are only allowed to sell insurance to cultivators. Okay, there's a policy restriction, and the idea is that you need an asset with like an insurable interest, right, which is defined to be land, right? But when you're trying to sell index insurance like Jennifer does, right, you don't actually need land, right? It's just like in index insurance is I'm going to measure rainfall, and if it rains enough, you don't get a payout. If it doesn't, you get a payout, right? So you could buy that insurance. Like if you had a gambling habit and you wanted to bet on rainfall in Tamil Nadu this year, you could do it, right? Yeah, and maybe that's why the Indian government prevents landless laborers from doing it, like people without land. But there's other ways to solve the problem. You can show an address in Tamil Nadu, and that should be sufficient, right? So now think about, now let's think through the theory. So I could actually run an experiment where I start selling insurance, but let's think about the theory of what would happen, okay? And by the way, I'm telling a story, but there's thousands of data points behind it. I'm just not going to go into econometrics. But everything I'm telling you is kind of based on rigorous evidence. So what happens is, when you sell insurance to cultivators, they start taking more risk, right? They switch away from safe rice varieties that are low growth, low productivity, but more drought and flood resistant, right? And into less drought resistant technologies that are higher growth, right? Which is perfect. That's exactly what you want to happen. That's the purpose of insurance. You want people to shift into high productivity stuff, right? That's what creates growth. But now think about what happens to the landless laborers. When the cultivators start switching into these risky technologies, the environment becomes more risky for the laborers, right? So when there's good rainfall, there's a lot of demand for their labor because now there's a bumper crop, right? So wages rise. But when there's a drought, wages will now, and the crops will fail even more, right? So wages fall even beyond the counterfactual of what would have been, right? So now, in theory, you can actually make the landless laborers worse off by introducing insurance, given the policy context, right? And so we show this in the data, that cultivators take more risk, wage volatility increases, right? Wage growth, the average level of wages should increase as well, because on average they should do better, but wage volatility increases, and then it depends on, the welfare depends on how much you care about volatility versus average, right? And so this is what we call a general equilibrium effect in economics, right? That there's markets that are changing, the labor market's changing and interacting, and if you don't think through that theory, if you run an intervention, right, you, like, say, microinsurance, you're at a risk of actually making the life worse for the very people who have the most difficulty insuring themselves because they have no assets, right? And in fact, if you start selling insurance to landless laborers, by the way, we did that. we kind of got around the legal restriction to sell to some landless laborers. And then what happens is that when there's a drought, they get payouts, then they're not as desperate to supply labor during the period when wages are very low, when there are droughts, right? And because they're not as desperate, there's not as much of labor supply, and so they indirectly, so wages don't fall as much, so they indirectly insure other people, right, who are not getting insurance, right? So there's another beneficial general equilibrium effect there. And if you were to not think through that theory of how the insurance market and the labor market interacts, you run your trial, you learn nothing interesting or valuable, right? That's why I think theory is extremely important, even with the gold standard evidence.
Thank you very much. Other comments from panelists on that question, or?
Thanks for that. It's a very interesting comment or approach to it. I guess just one brief way of thinking about how theory leads to this pragmatic side. And one part I went into is the notion of whether you have a model that can do, inferential modeling, you can assess impacts on resilience, and so predictive modeling, you can improve targeting. But another side of it that I think ties into also what Jen was saying, this dynamic thinking can help inform what policy is most needed. And this relates, I believe, to what Dr. Mbark is saying, where if you're thinking that if you understand through the theory that people's greatest problem is their current level of well-being and that it's going to be too subject to a shock, then you try to change that level of well-being today. However, if you think that they're in an undue way or have a very high probability of experiencing a shock in the future, well, then you insure them. You change that probability threshold, or you cap the lower tier of their probability realization of their next period well-being in the future. And sometimes you'll actually look at, the entire system and where the poverty traps are just needs to be restructured. And then you need a game changer. You need something that's like women's empowerment, access to credit. And that's really more about changing how the entire system is working and changing what creates a poverty trap in general, right? So I think there's a very kind of fairly concrete way where the thinking about resilience theory relative to just regular well-being measurement can inform how you think about what policies are going to do. And that just is a thought that was spurred by what you were saying about the importance of insurance in that setting.
Marco, are you going to comment? Yes.
Thank you. I think it's an extremely interesting aspect, and maybe it's the most challenging. I think that we all, as practitioners or academics or whatever, we that are working on the resilience measurement, we have two very complex tasks. The first one is to detect, say, the right indicators and the right determinants, the right variables, the different 3, 4, 5, whatever aspects that can then be proposed as policy interventions. The second one is to make sure that we deliver the right message to the right person. That is to say, to link with the ministries, with the National Bureau of Statistics, with those who are in the actual policy-making process, which is extremely complicated. I see that someone is understanding the big problem. So that's extremely delicate. And on top of this, there is one more concept. Resilience is extremely context-specific. If a manager manages to measure resilience with respect to one shock, this doesn't mean that next year they will be hit by the same shock. This doesn't mean that the next year they will be hit maybe by the same shock with a different intensity. So we need to be very careful before saying, I found a way. I know that if you increase this, you will no more suffer drought. It's impossible. So we need really to be very much careful when we deliver this type of message.
Jen, yes.
Yeah, thanks, Marco. And just to add on to that, this goes back to some of the comments Greg was making at the beginning, where we're working often with households who are facing many, many different shocks, often at the same time. And while we like to have conversations about resilience measurement, and I love having conversations about resilience measurement, measuring the shocks is just as important. And people are doing a lot of work on figuring out how to measure shocks. Slow onset, context-specific shocks like drought are actually really hard to measure in a way that is clearly linking the shock and the impacts. So I think that one of the innovations in the resilience dialogue is actually thinking about shocks and how shocks are impacting our ability to sustain development impacts. But we need to think about how we're measuring those shocks as well.
Very good. Actually, I'm going to go off script here. I have a list of questions, which I told the panelists I was going to ask. But actually, Jen, I want to pick up on this point and ask if you either have ways or you have thoughts on how to deal with the fact that shocks are not just multidimensional, but they're multidimensional and they're interactive. Right? There's a simultaneity to them. So a price shock may lead to a food insecurity shock, which then leads to a health shock, which then leads to an economic shock and livelihood shock. How do you deal with that? Or how might one deal with it as part of a measurement protocol? And so, I'm gonna. I don't know if you have a comment. I'm inclined to call on you because I know you have to leave soon. If you have thoughts on not just the multidimensionality but the interactive nature of simultaneity of shocks.
I don't actually have a well-formed thought on that. When you were talking about Greg's talk, I just remembered. So Greg asked us to make sure that we translate our findings into actionable programs, right? And then that reminded me. That made me think that, like, the story I just told about insurance. This is important enough that, like, a lot of your practitioners who might have influence, right? If you talk to policymakers in India, tell them that it's important just to extend insurance to people who are landless, right? And I think it's extremely important, right? In fact, I think it's so important if you have an Indian friend, tell them. Or if you go to an Indian restaurant tonight, tell them. And on the interactions, so I just want to point out that while shocks are interactive and they happen in multiple dimensions, right? The converse is also true, where our mitigation mechanisms, resilience mechanisms, such as diversifying income sources, savings, insurance, credit, these are also interacting. So the system is extremely complex in that the value of providing a migration alternative or providing a savings program depends very much on what exists on the insurance market or in the credit market.
It's inconvenient when it comes to analysis. This kind of simultaneous. Yes, Jim. Yeah.
So I'm not sure that I have a very good direct answer to your question, but I think that it speaks to the need to have a lot of different people in the room when you're talking about designing programs, so when you're talking about measuring resilience and measuring the impacts of these shocks and the programs that we do. I did a lot of work on livestock insurance, both in my academic work and also at USAID. And I have a friend who's a livestock advisor at USAID, and he reminds me constantly that while I may be thinking about the impact of drought on the family because of the potential loss of their livestock asset, he's always reminding me that the drought also has direct impacts on livestock health, not just through lack of water, but other diseases that they become more susceptible to. And so when we're designing insurance programs, we have to think about, well, how should we involve veterinary care? These are very complex issues because of these different shocks and how they interact. And I think making sure that we leave space for everybody who should be engaged in that conversation in a really interdisciplinary way is important.
Good. Thanks. I'm going to switch now, but just in the interest of time, sorry to cut off the panelists who may have had other responses, and because we have two more portions to this panel, and one is to invite BIFAD members to ask questions and then have a general open Q&A. So let me now ask if BIFAD members have any questions for the panel or points they'd like to raise.
I'll generally, and then I want to go specific information from Dr. Mubarak, but generally, and it's critical to policy development in looking at the human condition, and that is the fact that all societies adopt and adapt to conditions for the resilience that they face under whatever those conditions are. So there's a lot of resilience built into rural-urban migration patterns, to the distribution system of families. I mean, a lot of anthropological literature showing how basically you have a social security system embedded in the distribution that goes on in folk cultures, right? I mean, so all that's there. And so looking at something specific like migration, which I've looked at a lot over my own history of the Appalachian region and urban systems. There's a system that it's the system itself and that you have to examine also for resilience between the way the urban sector is connected to the rural sector. And then among rural sectors, subcultures vary significantly. And so all of that was just in the background of how you deal analytically then with an insurance case like you did. And I was interested in any comments you might have on that. And particularly I was interested in the caloric gain of one group. It was not clear to me what determined that caloric gain. Was it just income growth, or is the composition of families held constant and so forth? I just didn't fully understand that. Thanks.
I'll just respond to the specific questions, and I'll leave the general questions for the other panelists. So on the caloric gain, yeah, I gave you the shortcut version. What ends up happening is when I said 80% of people are successful, they're successful in finding employment in the city quickly enough to generate enough income, such that they can save about half of it, and they either remit it back or bring it back home, right? So it's coming from the fact that most people find work in construction sites or in rickshaw pulling, right? And those wages and work hours are much better than they are in rural areas, right? So that's the simple answer. And then the more complicated answer about systemic links, right? Now, using, again, gold standard evidence to study systems is, like randomized control trials to study systems is complicated, okay? So let me just give you a flavor of how we started doing that, okay? So now, in subsequent years that I did not describe, like we've continued doing this research, except that what I do is in this village over here, right, I make offers, these bus ticket offers, simultaneously to up to, say, 70% of the landless households. Okay? And in this village here, I just make offers to 10%. Okay? So what's going to happen is that I get a big systemic shock in this village. A lot of people are migrating together, right? And not such a big labor supply shock in this village. And that allows me to study things like, okay, if you and a lot of your friends and neighbors are receiving offers at the same time, right? Do you behave differently? So if I'm in this village, what's happening is Mushfiq and many of his friends get offers. Over in this village, Greg gets an offer as well, just like me, but not many of his friends get it. And do we react differently to it, right? And further, not only do we react differently, are we doing better at the destination when we're traveling together? And most importantly, when a lot of people are leaving, are the people who are left behind in the village, are they worse off? Okay. And the answer, it turns out that when a lot of people leave together, wages in the village rise. So the employers have to pay for it, but the villages are actually doing better. Okay. Even people who don't migrate, they do better, right? But of course, now I'm worried about the next phase of the research, which with Greg's help, we're now doing in Nepal as well. I'm worried about the political reaction of those landed employers, because they can politically organize and start complaining about the fact that many of their laborers are gone, right? So what can we offer them? And that's what we're doing now.
Hi. Yes. I think what you all are doing is brilliant. And the theory, I'm a strong advocate of theory. What Greg talked about this morning is this jump that you have made. Where we were 5 or 10 years ago, at best, was a laundry list of vulnerabilities. And what we were doing is tinkering and trial and error approach. We don't have the time, we don't have the resources. It's not a practical way to go about it. The practical way is what you're talking about. Because really what I see you doing is complex systems theory and complex systems modeling, which I've actually never seen applied in a practical context like this before. But that's where my question comes, because I think that's the challenge. And Jennifer, you just touched on it. Mark, this can't be a side conversation because you're not going to be successful.
Right.
You've got to have it in a room with all of those people in. Mm-hmm. Because what you're ultimately asking is, what are these variables, which are the shocks, and then the kind of talk that Amit gave us is then there's tactics to address each of those shocks. My question to you is, as a community, in a perfect role for our U.S. academies and our international partners, because that's where this is going to come from. And then we get guidance on which, and if you're robust about this, you will give us a model that can be applied across all the countries, because if it's not important, we shut the parameter down. If it's important, we open it up. If we don't need the data, we don't collect it. If it says we've got to have fine-grained data, we go out and generate it. So it's going to give us all kinds of guidance, and it's going to be practical and economic and move us faster. But my question back to you as a community is, so where do you think you are on that trajectory to getting the right people in the room to really look at this in a robust way and not look at it from a series of compartmentalized strategies or tactics, and you need, how are you pulling it together, and what do you need to do to keep pulling it together, and how do we help you?
I'm going to make one comment, then quickly turn it to the panelists, because it's really there, as I said to Marco, it's your show, not my show. So, but the one thing, thank you very much for allowing theory to be brought to the table, and emphasize the need to have this discussion in a whole. We don't, as a group, we don't have enough of this. It often is cordoned off. So I very much appreciate that point. The question about where we are, I think, is that what we're trying to do, we've been trying to do, I think, not as effectively as we could have done some years ago, but we're moving in this direction, is to make sure that measurement as an enterprise is more of a demand-side function than a supply-side function. There's a long tradition of research that talks about how we translate research into practice. And that suggests that it's a top-down approach to doing research. And I think we very much need to have this be a demand-driven approach, and from the very beginning, have the policymakers and have the practitioners drive our research agendas. For people doing applied work, it's how it should be. And so the more we get into a room together, the more we have this pushback that's painful, really, but it's a productive kind of effort, because it disturbs our worlds. It disturbs the kind of linear world we live in as academics, where our research has its home, it reaches nirvana when it shows up in a journal that nobody reads. That can't be. Not for this kind of room, and not for the work that we're interested in. That kind of work must grow up and improve the lives of beneficiaries. That's its final resting place, not journals and journal articles. Those aren't mutually exclusive. But so I think, let me turn it to the panelists, though, because it's for me, it's a passionate point that you've raised. I think it's an important one. So yeah.
Yeah, I second Mark's thanks for the comment and very kind of acute understanding of what's going on here, and your appreciation of that. But coming straight out of my presentation, one response that I would have to where we are in terms of being able to do this, where you can say to practitioners, this is the measurement approach you should use here for this goal, and this is how this applies, is that a challenge we have now is that, and maybe some of this is coming from both sides because it's a self-reinforcing cycle, that every measurement method out there is pitching itself to promise everything, a panacea that can do everything. And then the donor in turn is also asking for a measurement method to do everything. And so they end up basically in competition with each other, where we're sort of trying to say, oh, mine's better than this one because of that, when in reality, the way that I see it, if you let theory inform it, each of them has their strengths and weaknesses. So if it becomes less about, which approach is going to win the funds, and more about what exactly do we need from this approach? What's the feasibility of the data available? What are we trying to do with it, right? Are we trying to actually use it to predict? Are we using it for impact assessment? And then have a framework for which of these methods is better suited to that particular context and needs and goals, right? As opposed to trying to have this competition of ours is better and we can all do everything, right? And I think that's the bind I see that we're in, and moving toward an approach where we're a bit more open-minded and thinking theoretically about what are you genuinely trying to do with this, which kind of has to come from both sides, as in the practitioners or the researchers not trying to claim that they can do things they can't, and the donors being a bit more focused about what they really need from the method, rather than saying we want you to be able to have impact assessment, prediction, the whole kind of panacea. So that's how I see it from my perspective, but it's maybe just one approach.
I have a lot of different thoughts, but I'm going to try to keep it brief because I know that we're running out of time and want to have time to engage people online as well. But one thing is I would first make a pitch, because our third panel of the day is on leveraging university capacity and resilience measurement, research networks, and training the next generation. So I think we're going to have a robust conversation about how the donor community, the academic community, the practitioner community can work together better to kind of hone in on some of these details, including the interdisciplinary research and some of those things. Better leveraging the data that we have. But another comment I would make is, and I was lucky a couple years ago to do a paper with Joanna and Chris Barrett on food security measurement and food insecurity. And when you think about, it took 50 years to go from kind of the first ways of measuring food security to what we have today, which is really a pretty exciting way of thinking about food security in terms of stability over time and all the different components that we think are important. And so I think that while it's important that we move quickly, we have only been doing this for, 5-6 years, really. And so I think that it is an iterative process. USAID has invested a lot over the last 5 years at looking at, doing some resilience programming, measuring what have been the impacts of those, what are the determinants, what are we seeing as important to resilience over time. Like, we're seeing that financial services are important, social networks are really important, financial services are important. And so as we get more of that data, we can iterate and have conversations with the academic community to figure out how to more systematically include those in our approaches to measurement. USAID has put out recently a whole bunch of guidance notes on measuring resilience, and I think that they can be pretty widely applied to different contexts, but it will be a process of going back and forth and refining, and I think we can give ourselves the time to get it right.
Is there another question from the board? Then perhaps after this, we'll then turn it to the general audience.
So, Marco, just a quick question. The map you showed indicated you were active in lots of different countries. Was that because it was shock responsive, or are you in those countries because of the invitation of the local government, or what allows you to be in so many different geographies doing that kind of data gathering?
Thank you for the question. We performed our analysis upon request. So we received specific requests from in some cases, for example, as I showed for Uganda, is the OPM, Office of Prime Minister. In other cases, is National Bureau of Statistics. In other cases, is FAO or UNICEF or WFP or IFAD or other UN agencies that are interested in measuring resilience. And since our tool can be applied as an impact assessment indicator, they were requesting us to adopt it. So that's the reason why we are quite well spread in different countries. For example, in Central America, SICA approached us because they wanted to do this resilience measurement, and they were just willing to collaborate with us.
Okay, so now let's turn it for general question and answer. Thank you for the questions from the board. Greatly appreciated.
There is the gentle lady there.
Briefly. Question that picks up on something Joanna said about not which approach, but the right approach. One thing that I always get anxious about when I hear the phrase gold standard data is what we mean by that. The gold standard data, at least as it was referred to here, is all quantitative. It's all large-scale data, and ethnographers, I'm speaking from self-interest to some extent, we've been working on these kinds of questions for 40, 50, 60 years, and sometimes we see RCT results and we go, we knew that. So I'm wondering where these other forms of data might fit from the panel's perspective.
As a reminder, please introduce yourself so that people online know who's speaking.
Sorry, Ed Carr, Clark University.
Shall we collect some questions? Or we...
Yeah, let's collect two or three questions and let the panel then respond. So the question then to repeat is the focus is what about incorporating ethnographic and qualitative as part of resilience measurement? That's the first question.
My name is Abdullah Mbeng, and I'm from part of the African diaspora. And I listened to this very interesting discussion, and what I was wondering, did you include in your research, since you mentioned that it is a system approach, which is a lot of interrelated and interconnected part. And I do believe, as a member of the diaspora, that we do play a very important role when it comes to resilience, mostly in Africa. Because if you look at all the donors, what you contributed throughout the years, what the diaspora sent is more. And we do contribute towards resilience. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that as a member of the diaspora, we are finding ways to increase resilience, not only in Africa, but within our communities. And one simple example that I can give, if you look at the Murid communities in the United States, they have Islamic Center. They're using social network, as Dr. Mubarak said, to support each other. And the biggest risk that we have is when we pass away here in the US. Everybody wants the body to be sent home. It costs $10,000. We just find a way to do it, meaning everybody contributes $60 a month, a year, and when you pass away, they will ship your body for free. And the children also is for free. And the main reason why is that because of our religious belief, we cannot buy insurance. And this is not called insurance, it's called assistance. And that there's a source here in the US that you can tap into to answer and find solution to the resilience. And I'm just begging you to include the diaspora into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. One more question, then we'll let the panel respond.
Thank you. My name is Kelly Witkowski. I work for the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. A lot of the discussion from the panel so far has focused really on the household and community level, and I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more to where we are in terms of measurement and analysis at the national level or sectoral level. And specifically, you know, Marco, you gave the example of working with SICA, and I was wondering if you're working like on the implementation of a specific policy there, or how, you know, that work that RIMA is doing there is different from the national level and that you're doing more in Africa.
Good. Okay. So let's stop there with and let the panel respond to three questions. The first concerning the use and inclusion of qualitative and perhaps an ethnographic perspective. The second with the possible use of African diaspora. And then the third about different levels of measurement. So I'll turn it to the panel. Joanna.
Sure. So I'm going to start with a comment on the first point there. And the first answer that I can give you, and probably the best one, is an apology from the point of view of most economists, which is to say that we tend to be very hand-wavy about the qualitative side. And I'm right with you on a lot of analysis going into something that's really a well-duh if you're from the anthropology or ethnography disciplines. But one thing I will say is I think that there's a bit of a way forward here, especially if we're talking about matching a measurement approach to a context and a need. For a slight pitch for the next panel on the practical side, I've been working with this MIRA approach in Madagascar that was been done in Malawi. And I specifically, because I've been leaning a bit more on the qualitative side with my work with ILRI lately, working with actual qualitative scientists, not economists who think they do qualitative work, and tried to actually put together some protocols for focus group discussions that are designed specifically to refine the questionnaire, the list of shocks, and the shock interactions, to go back to this earlier question of shock interactions in that context, and then to do a calendar with communities of dietary diversity so that you can better interpret the dietary diversity score as it changes over time. And I've been working on developing specifically some qualitative tools that then can be fed into a quantitative questionnaire, both for developing it and then interpreting it. So I think that that's, you know, one approach that I see as a way out, but I think it needs to be taken way more seriously, especially to avoid a lot of expense for the well-done answers that you intuitively could have known if you sat there for a while. Right.
Thanks. Just want to clarify or give a definition to an acronym. Joanna mentioned MIRA. That's the project based at Cornell University with myself, Erwin, and Nathan Jensen, who's now at ILRI. And MIRA stands for Measurement Indicators for Resilience Analysis, because Marco had already taken RIMA. We had to play with the letters. We have MIRA. He has RIMA. Yeah. Jen.
I'd like to just briefly, I guess, touch on the second two questions. The first on the diaspora, I think we are doing something. So we are, there are a lot, Joanna mentioned the LSMS ISA data set, which does have data on remittances. So that is something that we are often able to capture in some of these analyses, and we know that they're incredibly important. So thank you for bringing that up. Although I don't think that there's been maybe enough work focused on the diaspora as kind of the primary subject of research. I do know that there has also been some work done on looking at Sharia-compliant financial instruments that can be used to increase resilience of households, and as well as some really exciting approaches that USAID is looking at in partnership with some of our researchers and private sector partners, looking at how can we engage some of our value chain partners, some of the big agro companies, for example, to think about offering funeral assistance to the people who sell them the commodities that they use in their like coffee or chocolate value chains. So because we recognize that funeral expenses, health insurance, these may not be covariate shocks, but they are incredibly impactful at the household level. So thank you for those comments. On the macro level, just briefly, I'd want to mention that we are doing some work with the African risk capacity, and USAID is also working with a lot of other donors, the international community, to think about how governments are better managing their exposure to risk and how they can do contingency planning and look at the different financial mechanisms that are available to them to help plan better in advance of shocks, and also implement programming to support households and communities more quickly after shocks.
Yeah, thank you. I think that data is maybe one of the most relevant problems for resilience measurement, because it's quite complicated. In some cases, we are forced to do data collection, because if we are supposed to do impact assessment in a specific area, the largest part of the time we have to. The largest part of the time we try to coordinate and collaborate with other existing partners. I can mention a few examples. In Somalia, we were coordinating with 2 large NGOs consortium exactly to reduce the shock of the interview fatigue to people and to save money and save costs and time and things like this. Especially because at the end of the day, we are all collecting more or less the same type of information. No? So we could really easily harmonize our tools, and of course, normally what we do is to include different approaches, especially because resilience is very complex, and we can't oversimplify the complex concept like resilience. We try to integrate with the mixed method approach, which includes qualitative assessment, so qualitative data collection, because in this way we can capture things like the role of the different actors in supporting resilience and so far. So it's quite complex. We try as much as we can to use the secondary sources data, but there are moments where you definitely need to do the data collection, because it's also true that it's plenty of data sets around there. It's plenty of bad data sets collected in very poor way. So we need to be very extremely careful on this. With regard to SICA, where we are, well, it's an extremely interesting exercise, because it is all organized and managed by the SICA organization, pulling together I think it's 7 countries in the Central America, and they're good. They're extremely good. So, and it's the first time in my life I work with so high-level people, and I've been impressed. I mean, we went there, we provided them with training. The training became very much interactive, with different levels, with different degrees of expertise, with different, schedule. They are moving ahead. They are running their own RIMA. And what I always mention about at least our approach is that it's a framework. Now, it's an econometric approach. That's what you have to use more or less. But all the rest is adaptable. And that's exactly because of the nature of resilience. The resilience in Nicaragua or, whatever, Panama, whatever, is not the same as it can be in Somalia and other countries. So the largest part of the variables have been changed, decided by them together with us. And I also suggested to change some of the pillars, because it depends very much on what's relevant for them. And they are moving ahead. I had an email from Patricia a couple of days ago. Some of them are done. Some other are moving ahead with different time. But that's extremely interesting exercise.
Very good. As I'm trying to be the timekeeper here, I see we've arrived just right about at 12:15. So I'll conclude this session. If you could join me in thanking the panelists for their presentation.